You may or may not have managed to make it through my previous talk with Lord Trace of Kansas City, but if you did, one of the takeaways from that talk, I think, even if it wasn't mentioned explicitly, was the concept of fake it until you make it. Now, you might recall that Trace mentioned that many people were interpreting his appearance and the way he projected himself in a way that didn't really accord with how Trace himself perceived the way he was. And that Trace ultimately decided to make the best of that, right? You take what you can get, and so on and so forth. Now, it's strange to me, given all the talk of pills, blue pill, red pill, white pill, purple polka dot pill, black pill, brown pill, all these pills, right? That very few people talk about the somewhat nebulous concept, to be fair, but nonetheless this concept of fake until you make it. Because fake till you make it, although it's not a scientific concept, is something I've definitely seen a number of times in my life, and it could be a strategy for some people. But in discussing the concept of fake it until you make it, I think we need to talk about the parameters. What are the limitations there? Or more specifically, what delimits fake it until you make it? Who are the people who are capable of it, and who are the people who are not? One of the most prominent examples of fake it until you make it I had ever encountered was sometime almost 20 years ago when I was living and working in South Korea, and I had a colleague or a coworker, however you want to frame it, who had come over to South Korea from the UK, from Wales specifically, came from a working class background, pretty disadvantaged, I'd say, overall. And the gentleman in particular was not amazingly attractive, decent looking, good height, probably about 6 feet, maybe a little bit taller, but he had a certain charm to him, right? He was also a philanderer, a serial philanderer, had a girlfriend but was cheating on her constantly, and an alcoholic to boot. And it was from him that I learned the rather charming phrase, many, many times I heard this, by the way, "Oh, I'm well boozed. Oh, mate, I'm well boozed. Oh, I'm well boozed." Now, whether he actively believed in it or not, this gentleman that I'm referencing, the Lord of Wales, was in fact an exemplar of the philosophy of fake it until you make it. He was practicing effectively what later we would come to call geomaxing, but he sat it out for quite some time in Korea and ascended the hierarchy, if you will, in largest measure due to his charm, personality. Like I said, he was very, very charming in his own way. Not exceptionally attractive, but he had a certain charm to him, and people found it, I guess you could say, intoxicating. The men thought he was friendly and chipper, and he got along with a lot of people. And the women found it charming in other ways, obviously. And he managed to keep on swinging jobs that would get him more money, more prestige, and so on and so forth. And all of this with really no skills to speak of, no real knowledge. He would simply chat his way through most situations. Until one day he received a position as a university lecturer, although he eventually did get a master's degree of some sort. It had absolutely nothing to do with his teaching responsibilities, and to this day he's remained. Pretty good position, pretty well paid, and has a ton of free time and holiday time to boot. All this, to my mind, a byproduct of this principle of faking it until you can make it. But if you've noticed something in describing the gentleman, you probably would have noticed that he was very charming, to say the least, right? He had something going for him. Do I think, for example, that in this day and age, if he were under different circumstances and had to present all this only online vis-a-vis his appearance, that he would have done nearly as well? Well, no. Right? I mean, he's married, I believe, to this day, but I'm pretty sure he's still a philanderer. I'm pretty sure he still cheats. Nonetheless, I don't think he would have had half the luck he had if he wasn't able to exercise that charm that he had. Because at the end of the day, he was a sweet talker. And that was his ticket to get into things. And I should add to all this that in his version of faking it until you make it, most of the jobs he was taking on were pretty nebulous. They were called teaching jobs, but they didn't require a real teaching background. There wasn't really any curriculum he had to follow per se. A lot of it was him just talking his way through challenges, even if he didn't know certain things. And That's a very specific kind of faking it until you make it. Well, bigger question is, how well does fake it until you make it work in a broader, wider context? But let's first talk about the barrier to entry here. It goes without saying that a lot of the principles that apply to fake it to make it also apply to basic dating principles, right? So if you're a so-called sub-5, not average looking, significantly below average, there probably isn't a thing you could do in the world to fake it until you make it. Whatever it is you do have, whatever skills you do have, let's say you're a genius analyst of financial markets, you might still get hired as a 3.5, but your skills better be rock solid, real, and they better be bloody damn profitable, right? So there's this kind of barrier to entry that is very similar to other barriers to entry throughout our society. It has a lot to do with looks. You need to look at least average, right? Probably be on the taller side, obviously. Once you hit the average range in terms of looks, then certain possibilities might open up. Now, this gentleman, the well-boozed gentleman that I mentioned, was also extremely extroverted to a degree I've rarely seen in many individuals. And so that is a quality that he possessed, redounded to his great favor and benefit ultimately. Another instance I have observed in my life of fake it to make it involved a guy who was, you could say, traditionally very attractive. Must have been at least 6 feet tall, quite a good face, say an 8 or an 8 plus. And I noticed at the time, this is many years ago when he still worked in an office, he was a bit slow on the performance, right? But everyone was willing to cut him some slack, especially the women, the colleagues. They all thought he was nice and friendly, and to be fair, he was. He wasn't a mean person, it seemed. But he wasn't the most skillful person at the job. And the people at the office kept on granting him break after break after break, even after mucking up and cocking up on a fairly frequent basis. Eventually he got a lot of it down, but he wasn't exactly the best worker, but people just liked him. Now, he did have a nice personality, like I said, he was a nice guy, but he also was conventionally attractive, quite so. And so that's another example of a kind of unintentional faking it until you make it. The guy kind of knew what he was doing in the respective field, but not really. And there were a lot of gaps. You could probably tell at the time that he got hired because of his looks and his friendly, approachable personality, and that had he not had these attributes, his looks, personality, and height, he probably would not have been hired given how poor his performance overall was. And in general, one can observe this. I've observed this throughout my life, that people who look better are granted more leeway, etc., etc. So basically, in that other example, the guy eventually got the stuff down that he needed to get down and learned the stuff he had to learn. But it took such a long time to get there that one wonders if another individual who had not been endowed with his looks or his personality would have been given as many chances as he had gotten. And I would say almost certainly not. So in essence, fake it until you make it can be reduced down to this idea of getting your feet in the door even if you're not entirely qualified or competent enough at a certain task or job because of your charm, your looks, or any combination of the above, and then eventually hoping in time that things kind of even out as you learn the appropriate skills and what have you. Now, of course, this is all dependent upon passing certain tests. There is a basic looks test you have to pass. There probably is a personality test, too, in addition to a looks test, meaning that if you are not sufficiently approachable in terms of your personality, you might fail the basic fake it until you make it test as well. And then in the process of you trying to acclimate to this new environment, this new job, this new situation, you may or may not make it in the long run, because whether you make it depends on how much grace other people are willing to grant you, which again depends on things like both looks and personality. In the case of the alcoholic Welsh gentleman I mentioned, he was okay in looks, but it really was his personality, very, very charming and just very outgoing. And for whatever reason, he managed to sort of out-talk everybody. In the case of the other guy I mentioned, conventionally attractive, tall, just very friendly overall, nice. You couldn't really dislike the guy. And obviously women were swooning for him, and the guys probably thought he was an okay guy. Given tons of chances despite several mistakes he made on the job, and nonetheless was able to persist there. So there are these caveats. But once you pass that threshold, it really is a matter of time until how far you can go. And I think it is also a question of how technical the job is that you need to do, or whatever it is that you need to do in the first place. If your job is to teach an English class, there are technical things you can do, I can assure you, but it doesn't need to be. And you can apply a fake it until you make it principle more readily. If the job is more technical, then it's going to be difficult. So for example, let's take the legendary Pete, Lord of Ireland, smiter and slayer of tax dragons, the Baron of Brooklyn, who is a certified accountant. Could you fake it until you make it if you looked really good in that job? Maybe. But people still are depending upon your competence and your ability to deliver when it comes to the job. Eventually, no matter how good looking you might be, you probably will be fired or lose your job, I would imagine. But another interesting question that arises from all of this is the question of, well, does this also apply to dating and mating? Because a lot of guys try to posture, right? In some sense, dressing a certain way, getting a certain haircut, even packing on muscle and trying to make yourself more attractive is a way of faking it until you make it, especially if you're not naturally athletic, for example, or naturally inclined towards these things. You bend yourself, you reshape yourself until you acquire some new form that is potentially more pleasing to the opposite sex. And I think actually probably more likely, to be perfectly honest, than it is at a conventional job. Faking it until you make it as a principle is probably more applicable to the dating and mating game. If you can, quote unquote, maintain frame, which is to say, if you can maintain the fake setup that you've created, the image that you projected to the outside world, which is also the thing that the female in question will have taken an interest in. Not you, but the image you've projected to the outside world. And so in a relationship context, I think, similar to a job, where effectively you're on the clock until you're discovered, they finally figured out whether or not you're actually competent or not. I think that in the mating dating game, it's quite similar, because if you're just doing some sort of fake it till you make it routine, whether it's projecting wealth outwards that you don't have, or just bending and almost reforming yourself to a degree that you don't feel comfortable with, eventually it's going to come out too, if you're only doing it for the sake of box or for the sake of just acquiring a female partner. So, in essence, fake it until you make it can work. But there are all sorts of caveats that go along with that. Like I said, you need to look a certain way. You need to have a certain type of personality. If you don't have these things, you can't fake it. If you're 5'3" and unattractive as a male, you will not be able to do anything in the realm of fake until you make it. However, if you pass the basic looks test and you have some kind of personality, you might be able to up until a certain point. And then it becomes a question of, will they discover the truth or not? Or will you be able to acclimate quickly enough such that you are not discovered? And the same is true of a relationship. So fake it until you make it can work under certain circumstances, in certain situations. But the real question is, even if you pass these basic tests that allow you to potentially exercise fake it until you make it, would you want to do that? Because by definition, if you are faking it, if that's not really you, or you're presenting something that isn't really you, and you were never really comfortable with the presentation, is it really worth it in the long run? Especially because you're going to have to do this probably for the rest of your life, if that's the kind of life that you want to live. Personally, I don't think it's worth it, but that's just my opinion. Anyways, as always, thank you for tuning in. Please hit the like button, leave a comment, hit that bell icon to be notified of my forthcoming videos, because a lot of people have told me that they are not getting my video feed, which is, I guess you could say, standard YouTube, whatever. Subscribe if you hadn't subbed yet. Share the video, yada, yada, yada. All that YouTube jazz. And if I'm still alive, I'll check you out later. May the gods watch over you. Take care. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.